Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second semi-final of the New Zealand Initiative's Next Generation Debates, fresh perspectives on the big social issues. My name is Oliver Hartwig, I'm the director of the New Zealand Initiative. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. Before we get started and do anything else, I'd like to thank the Friedlander Foundation for the very generous support for this project. Michael Friedlander has been a long-standing background supporter of many projects designed to improve public understanding of why public policy matters. And without the Friedlander Foundation's support, this tournament wouldn't have happened. Many thanks also to Lion for the use of this splendid venue and for generously providing us with drinks to help us through the debate. The aim of the tournament is to get people, especially young people, thinking and talking about public policy issues and understanding why they matter. As most of you know, that's the initiative's mission, promoting sound public policies that will make for a better standard of living for all New Zealanders. To give you a background to tonight's event, I'd just like to tell you a bit about how the Next Generation debates work. We've got university debating teams consisting of the top two debaters from Auckland, Victoria, Canterbury and Otago universities, and they all entered the tournament. The heats kicked off here, actually in Auckland last Monday at the Tangaroa College in Otago, followed by Epsom Girls Grammar, Auckland Grammar School and Onehunga High School. And then we moved on to Wellington, where we held debates at Haratonga College in Upper Hutt and at Wellington College. And the topics we've debated so far were the decline of traditional marriage, whether same-sex couples should be allowed to adopt, whether the drinking age should be raised to 20, whether school league tables should be published, whether fatty food should be banned from school tuck shops, and whether smoking should be banned. And tonight, this is our second semi-final, because we just had another one in Auckland last night. And last night, we had Auckland and Otago University, the teams battle it out over the mood that Chinese investment in New Zealand farms should be banned. And it was a very entertaining and a very close debate, and it came down to a 2-1 split decision between the three judges. However, the Auckland team, arguing that Chinese investment in New Zealand farms shouldn't be banned, won the heat. Following the debate last night, we had a lively audience and panel discussion. The panelists last night were the editor-in-chief of the National Business Review, Neville Gibson, and a barrister and Save the Farms spokesperson, Tony Boucher. The grand final debate of this series will be held next week, Wednesday, the 15th of August, at the Academy Galleries here in Wellington. So the mood tonight is that a minimum wage helps young people get a fair start in the workforce. And I should hasten to explain that the position reflected in the mood is designed to make for a good debate, and it does not necessarily reflect the views of the New Zealand Initiative. Perhaps I should also say that the teams didn't really have a choice. They were allocated a topic, and well, we'll see whether they're comfortable with it. But in any case, the New Zealand Initiative, of course, takes an interest in issues around employment regulations in New Zealand and how they affect our economy. So it should be a very interesting debate tonight, and it's interesting to see how the arguments play out. So we have four of the top debaters from New Zealand here tonight. So let me just introduce them quickly. From Canterbury University, arguing the affirmative side, we have Tom O'Brien. Tom is studying towards a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in history. As development officer for the Canterbury University Debating Society, Tom has been a constant member of Canterbury 1 for the past 2 years, and last year was the youngest adjudicator in memory to accredit as a qualified New Zealand University's debating adjudicator. This year, he's also coaching one of Canterbury's schools teams to compete at the National Schools Debating Championships later this month. We have Janelle Cook. Janelle is in her final year of a Bachelor of Laws with honours and a Bachelor of Arts majoring in Political Science and French. She's president of the Canterbury University Debating Society. Janelle has been an accredited adjudicator for the past 3 years and has regularly adjudicated at national tournaments. In her most recent tournament as a debater, Janelle was a member of Canterbury 1 and ranked second out of the Canterbury speakers at the tournament. And then on the Wellington team tonight, arguing the negative side, we have Richard Duff. Having completed a Bachelor of Laws with honours, Richard is currently completing the final semester of a Bachelor of Science with majors in Physics and English Literature. He's been involved in university debating for 6 years, winning the Australasian Championships in 2010, the World University's Peace Debate in 2011, and several major New Zealand tournaments, including 3 consecutive University Games titles. And we have Asher Emanuel. Asher is in his 3rd year of studying law and English literature. A semi-finalist in the 2012 Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championships, Asher has also been a success on the national debating circuit, twice winner and once best speaker of Easters, the national impromptu debating competition, and once winner of Joint Scroll, the national prepared debating competition. Finally, I should introduce our adjudicators, and they are Stephen Whittington. Stephen Whittington is a former champion and a three-time grand finalist of the Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championships and has also made the semi-finals of the World University Debating Championships. He is ranked as the second best speaker in Australasia and in 2012 ranked as the third best speaker in the world. He currently practices as a tax lawyer at Russell McVeigh. I think that will come in handy then. Will Chisholm. Will was a semi-finalist at the University Games in 2006 and 2007 and joined Scroll in 2007. He was also captain of the New Zealand University's prepared and impromptu debating teams in 2007. Will was the grand final adjudicator at the Australasian Intervarsity Debating Champs in 2010. Will is a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Arts with honours in economics from the University of Otago. He's currently working as an analyst in the international team at the Treasury. And then we have Daniel Wilson. And Daniel is in his fourth year of a study towards degrees in science and law at Victoria University. Daniel is a former winner of the Sir David Beattie Cup for public speaking, is the secretary of the Wellington Speaking Union, and was the co-convener of the 2012 Australasian Intervarsity Debating Championships. So the format for tonight is quite simple. Speakers from each side have 7 minutes each. We'll have a reply round of 3 minutes. There will be bells just about a minute before they should be finishing. And the mood tonight is to repeat that a minimum wage helps young people get a fair start in the workforce. So kick it off tonight, starting from the affirmative side, is Canterbury's Tom O'Brien.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's often said that children are our future. The problem is that what we're doing at the moment with our minimum wage is stifling that very future. A $13.75 minimum wage for youth is refusing to recognise the value that they add at a lower price point and preventing them from entering the labour market, preventing them from progressing in the workforce. So, what am I going to bring you today? Firstly, I'm going to run through what we stand for on this side of the house, and then I'm going to run through 3 key points. Firstly, why we actually have a minimum wage and why this isn't applied to youth. Secondly, why youth aren't being hired under the status quo. And thirdly, why we're going to see this change under our model. Janelle is going to talk about the benefits to businesses of hiring more youth at a lower wage. So, what we stand up for here today is youth minimum wage of about $10 for 16 to 18-year-olds. What we think this does is give new entrants a wage that allows them to compete despite the fact that they are less skilled and less attractive employees than adult workers. We think that that's really beneficial to letting them get a kickstart in their jobs. We think that's particularly important because the kids we're talking about often aren't necessarily going into professional careers, but you can make up that stopgap by doing things like getting an education at university or getting a degree. We don't always think you have the ability to do that for these kids, so we think it's important that they have a wage that gets them some work experience. So, why do we have a minimum wage? No thanks, Richard. What we think is that we recognise in society that for an adult who might have things like dependents, who's probably living on their own in like an apartment or with a partner who might not necessarily be working, we need to ensure a minimum standard of living. We think that's pretty well ensured by about $13.75, which is our minimum wage. What we think is that 16 to 18-year-olds don't face the same financial pressures and don't need as much money to get that minimum standard of living. We think that firstly, they usually don't have dependents. We think that secondly, they often have things like parental support or support from other organisations focused at youth. And thirdly, we see that they prefer communal living. They do things like flat with other people, which reduces their living costs. We just don't think that there's that pressing need to have as high a minimum wage for 16 to 18-year-olds as for other adults. So, that removes the justification for setting what is basically an artificially high wage, right? Because the whole point of a minimum wage is that it acknowledges that we need to pay people more than the market would dictate they should be paid. Because if we thought that everyone was worth $13.75 an hour, everyone will be paid $13.75 an hour. The problem is that's just not the reality. So we think that for these youths, about $10 is pretty appropriate. We think that that's the kind of money that they're going to need. We think that's supported under the status quo, right? Because we give people who want student loans less money than you would a beneficiary, because we recognise those people just do not need the same level of financing to get by on that minimum standard. So, beyond this, we think that the free market, beyond this minimum standard of living at about $10, we think that the free market should basically decide. But first I'll take Richard.
Given that Maori are systematically underemployed relative to Pākehā, would you have a Maori lower minimum wage? If not, why?
No, we think that the two issues, first and foremost, are actually quite linked, right? We think that a lot of Maori leave school early. We think a lot of Maori don't go on to tertiary education. And so we actually think that if we do this in the youth wage, we're going to help those kind of people, Mr. Speaker. And we don't think that there's a lack of correlation between youth who don't get employed and Maori. So we think that goes towards fixing that problem. And secondly, that's just not what we're debating here today, Richard. So maybe we can chat about that some other time. So why do we think that the free market should basically decide how much people get paid? So we think that there are two big reasons. Firstly, we think that it allows people of variable skill levels to compete based on merit and based on whether or not they'll be a good employee. And the reason for that is that they can vary their charging rate. People who aren't as skilled can charge a lower charging rate. And that allows them all to compete, that allows people based on merit to get a job. But secondly, we think it's really beneficial with regards to efficiency. And Janelle's going to talk about this more with regards to the benefits to businesses. But what we see is that where there is an artificially high wage set for labour, it creates distorted incentives on businesses. Because there's not a legitimate choice made between when you invest in labour and when you invest in things like infrastructure and innovation. It means that gaps that could just be plugged by labour aren't, and we're instead wasting money on things like technological advancement that might not necessarily be particularly economically efficient. So that's why we feel that the minimum wage isn't necessary here. So let's look why youth aren't being hired under the status quo. The reality is that because the minimum wage artificially raises the threshold as to how much people can be paid, there's basically a crush of low-skilled workers. There are a whole lot of people who aren't particularly skilled, who don't have a lot of experience, who all want to get jobs at $13.75 an hour. But a lot of jobs are being locked out because employers, want to pay them less than they're allowed to. And because they can't do that, they choose not to employ them. And of these, youth are often the least valuable. We think that firstly, they don't have any experience, but that secondly, as a result of that, it makes them a really risky investment. An older worker is a pretty clear investment. You have references from older workplaces, you have access to information about their prior work history, and all of that allows you to make up a pretty good picture of what kind of person you're employing. That's a safe employment choice. We think youth aren't a safe choice, and often people choose not to employ them. And thirdly, we think they're often transitory, and that means that they're sometimes seen as not being worth the investment of a higher wage when you have access to an older worker. So, how do we see this? So why is this negative? Why is this so bad? So the first thing we see is that work experience is often necessary to do things like build a work ethic, but also just to get entry into really low-level jobs. And we think that's particularly important, like I mentioned, because the kind of kids we're talking about aren't ones who are going to go to university and learn how to be lawyers and politicians and economists. These are the kind of kids who, if they don't get an entry-level job, have nothing. And we think that it's much better that they get that experience and get that foot in the door and are able to get a job than running on nothing. Secondly, we think it's really important in terms of independence, though. We think it's important for them to develop goals, to develop things like financial sufficiency, independence and sufficiency, and to be able to live on their own and to make their own choices. We think that mostly that is really valuable, that that's useful for our workers and youth going forward. So thirdly and finally, how does our solution solve this? Well, basically it's really simple. A lower required wage means that we create more jobs where it's not worth hiring someone paying them $13.75 an hour, but it is worth paying them $10 an hour. The reason that we're mainly creating new jobs here is because the extra skill brought by adult employees will still apply to many of the jobs that are currently charging the minimum wage for adults. We think that what we are going to create are new jobs, say as a petrol station attendant, for people who you don't need a huge amount of skill, but where price is the key incentive. And so therefore we'll see new jobs coming up here and youth being employed. Ladies and gentlemen, we should be ensuring that our youth have opportunities so that they can get jobs in the long run, so that they can be productive members of society. What they don't need is the protection of a minimum wage that locks them out of the market. They need the protection of a wage that reflects the value they add and allows them to compete and allows them to thrive regardless of their skill level. Ladies and gentlemen, we propose.
Friends, I want to start with a discussion with what the actual purpose of the minimum wage is, because it's more than just the kind of blunt economic tool that Tom would have you believe. The minimum wage is a statement about equality in New Zealand society. It's about saying that this particular rate of pay is the least amount of money that you can pay somebody to monopolise their time. that's the least amount of money, regardless of their age, regardless of their class, gender, colour, creed, etc. We think that when Tom says that young people are the future, he reflects the very whole in their case. That is, young people have more characteristics than simply being young, and this policy doesn't recognise that. They're hurting the people that they're trying to help. 4 substantive points to demonstrate just that. Firstly, I'm going to be talking in terms of rebuttal as to how they're going to increase the amount of employment and why we don't think that that's actually the case. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about discrimination and why we think on this side of the House we're not willing to tolerate a policy which encourages and sanctions just that. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the harms of the policy by class and the type of people that they wanted to pretend weren't actually in this discussion at all. Let's talk first of all in rebuttal in terms of the economics of this. The core of their case was the surplus created by this kind of situation where you could cut the rate of a whole number of your workers would necessarily be invested in more labour. They said young people are going to take jobs which are currently held by adults, and that's going to be good because it's going to get them a foot in the door. That ran entirely contrary to all of their analysis about how old people are in fact the very people who need jobs themselves because of the dependent children and the like. Moreover, it was a gross mischaracterization to say that businesses right now can't simply get enough labour. It's a highly competitive labour market. There are many people involved in it already. We don't want to increase competition on a metric which we don't think is valuable to compete on. Basically, a metric which is one of discrimination based on an immutable characteristic about yourself which you cannot change. Our conception on this side of the House is that actually you don't massively increase the amount of employment. You don't get more youth into jobs. There's a number of reasons for this. Firstly, hiring carries reasonably high costs. There's the risk of adopting new employees who you haven't tested before. There's the process of going through and finding somebody who you need to hire. There are the logistics of maintaining a larger and larger workforce. What does this mean when workers are now able to pay a large number of people a small amount of money? The best thing for them to do is, instead of increasing the number of people that they're employing and give the youth the foot in the door Tom wanted to give them, they cut costs and compete on prices. It's a highly competitive market right now in terms of staying afloat in this current economy. What would you prefer to do? Provide more hours to your existing workforce and try to compete based on price, or hire more risky workers? In this current environment, we think the latter is going to happen. Moreover, in terms of capitalisation with labour-saving technologies, the incentive is to keep your current workforce, not adopt the risks of bringing new people into the fold, and instead invest that surplus that you've accrued by paying them only $10 an hour to spend money on things like self-service checkouts and the like, which in the long term decrease the amount of employment in the future and the jobs which are available for people who desperately need them. We also don't think that the employment rate is actually going to change at all. In 2004, Treasury released a report that said actually the youth employment rate had not been affected by the change to the youth minimum wage rate in 2001. We think the economics is muddled. But there's bigger problems with the case than simply the economics, and that's in terms of discrimination. When Richard asked Tom whether or not he thought that other disadvantaged groups, for example, a group characterised by their ethnicity, should be provided with a minimum wage, Tom was unable to give you a satisfactory answer. His principle collapsed immediately because there was actually no principle behind this at all, except to allow businesses to exploit people based on some characteristic of themselves that they could not change. We live in a liberal democracy, friends, and that's about focusing on individuals rather than aggregates. You don't lump people together by things about themselves which they cannot change and say that their worth as a person is less because of that. We think that this is a very policy which says youth. You are by definition youth, and you're worth less because of that. We don't like discrimination on this side of the House because we like to think of New Zealand as a meritocracy. What does that mean? That means that you rise and fall on your own effort and decision. It's not about things that you cannot change about yourself, not about your ethnicity. You shouldn't be judged on your pay rate because of the colour of your skin or your beliefs. The same thing must be said of age, because there's more to a young person than simply their age. We think that discrimination in this kind of case prevents meritocracy because you're not judging people on the right characteristics. We think that's prima facie wrong to say that some people are worth less because of those unchangeable things about themselves. Tom.
Given that you don't have to pay a self-checkout counter a wage, don't you think that a lower wage might incentivise the hiring of more workers as opposed to making self-checkouts?
Well, if you have a lower wage, it means that you're probably going to employ people who can be operated on that lower wage, right? They're going to be able to do a roughly same amount of work, which leaves you with a surplus. What's your choice to do with that surplus? Bring in more labour and more labour, or do you expend it on technologies to, in the long term, reduce your reliance on labour? We think the latter occurs. Let's talk about harms by class. We think the result of this policy is going to be a wage depression for youth. We think youth are particularly bad at bargaining in employment situations because they're inexperienced at dealing with a wily employer. That means that most youth are going to be on this $10 an hour rate. They're not going to be able to bargain themselves up. We think that that's a particularly difficult problem because it means you are going to be faced with the choice of employing somebody on the higher rate or the lower rate. You're going to choose youth over adults. This results in harmful business practices. People are going to be substituted in and out by age. You're going to prefer to employ a young person over an old person. A younger workforce is less able to bargain and protect themselves in the workplace, and you have lower workplace standards as a result of that in terms of safety. Older workers who are replaced by youth are far less able to reskill and reinvent themselves to invest themselves in different markets and different areas where they could be successful. This disadvantages those whose jobs you are taking away. Moreover, you're placing an expiry date on an employee. At the point at which they turn 18, all of a sudden you have to pay them $3.50 more an hour. The incentive overwhelmingly there then is to fire them at the end of that cycle, bring in another young person, and the cycle continues, leaving people without skilled development. Because when somebody has an expiry date, when on their 18th birthday they're not worth anything to you, why would you spend time providing that person with skills when you can spend the excess you've made by paying them less on another self-checkout? Finally, I want to talk about families, because Tom wanted to say that young people don't have those kind of problems. It's a very middle-class case from that side of the house, because it's okay if you want to earn $10 an hour for some pocket money, but it's not okay, friends, when you have your own children. And there are a number of young people in our community who do have dependent families that they do need to provide for, and they deserve a living wage for that. Moreover, there are a number of young people who have to support families who are just scraping by at the moment when they're being paid a fair and equal wage. The bottom line is their economics is muddled and they're treating people based on something which they cannot change about themselves. That's unfair. Our young people are worth as much as everybody else.
We find it incredibly contradictory on the affirmative side of the house for Asher to stand up here and say everyone deserves an equal right and an equal chance, and then systematically exclude younger people with less skills from getting that first start in the workplace. We on this side of the house are looking for a fair start, ladies and gentlemen. That doesn't exist under the status quo. That's why we're here talking about that today, and their system isn't going to change that. That's why we need to change in the first place. I've got 4 points of rebuttal and a substantive point to bring you. Firstly, we're going to talk about why the minimum wage exists, because I actually like to think that it's not fair to pay people with less skill less for their time. That exists already, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we're going to talk about discrimination, and it's going to build on the fact that it's fine to pay a person less if they have less skills. It's just a recognition of the fact that you're giving them a start, ladies and gentlemen, that they don't come to you with skills already, and that's why we want the youth wage in the first place. The second point then is class, and how this isn't actually a class discrimination at all. Fourthly then, why it's okay for young people to take these jobs, because I actually like to think that young people having these jobs was a really bad thing for some unknown reason. And then fifthly, I'm going to bring a substantive point about businesses and why this is really a good thing for businesses in the status quo. So Tom's already covered why we have a minimum wage, right? It's a recognition of the fact that you need a certain amount of money to live. So I'm also going to talk to you about how younger people don't need that much money to live. They do things like flat sharing. They do things like not minding to live in a flat that doesn't have really good insulation, ladies and gentlemen. We do just accept, for a large amount of time, a lower living standard. And this happens in student loans as well, ladies and gentlemen. And so we recognise that we don't need as much money to live when you're younger, when you don't have people dependent on you bringing home a salary, when you don't have high medical bills. There's a lot of reasons why you don't need as much money. And so the reasons for having the minimum wage in the first place don't apply to younger people. That's why it's okay on that level not to pay them as much. So in terms of this being a justifiable difference, we think it is. In terms of discrimination, we don't think that this is discrimination. Firstly, because if you're not worth as much, we don't think that you should be paid it, given that you don't need that much money to live. Given that they're low skilled and they're going to be priced up by technology in a lot of situations, which is the substantive point I'm going to talk to you about, we don't think that this is something that is unjustifiable in the circumstances, ladies and gentlemen. We look at a number of reasons and a number of places where people are already differentiated on their skills, on their work ethic, on their general intelligence, ladies and gentlemen. People are paid at different grades throughout the workforce. Paying them differently based on their age isn't a discrimination, ladies and gentlemen. It's a recognition of the lack of skills and the lack of skills that exist, particularly in younger people, where they don't come to you knowing how to work the FPOS machine, and they don't come to you knowing how to work the petrol pump, and these really basic skills that they actually have to be taught. And this gives them an entry into the workplace, which we are very pro on this side of the house. So let's look at why it's okay for young people to take these jobs. Sure.
So if youth can survive unemployment presumably better because of all the factors you say mean they can live on less money, why are you pricing out the older workers and basically throwing them to the dogs to help the people you say can live
Well, when I
less?
said at the point I'm bringing you now is why it's okay for young people to take a job, that's obviously going to deal with the POI there. So when we say it's okay for young people to take a job, firstly, Tom's talked to you about how this is going to bring new jobs into the market, things like a petrol pump assistant and things like hiring another checkout chick instead of replacing it with these self-checkout things, which get really confusing. So what you see is that this is actually going to bring more jobs into the market to start with. So we're not going to get this like massive loss of jobs, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we see that young people are often more flexible in the hours that they can work. They don't have to go home and look after kids, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of the time. So they're more flexible in that regard. So we think that they'll be working late night shifts and shifts after classes, and these kind of things that a lot of other people don't want to work and that they're currently paid inflated amounts to do. And we think that this is a recognition of the lower level skill, doing a job that people might not want to do, but they're happy to do because they're not doing anything on the night instead of playing video games. So it's something that they're getting a relative benefit from, ladies and gentlemen, and something that we're happy to let them do if they want to go and work a late night shift that someone else doesn't want to take. So we don't think that there's going to firstly be that massive loss of jobs, and secondly, we think that any loss of jobs is justifiable because that's an employer's right to make that choice, and we think that they're going to make a good value judgment, ladies and gentlemen, whether it's worth taking on that more risky employment opportunity, whether it's worth taking that transitory worker who can't work the hours you may want them to work. We think that employers should be given an incentive to take those people on when they wouldn't otherwise, because otherwise you are pricing young people out of the market and you're not giving them a fair start. So onto the substantive point that I want to bring you, and that's on businesses and the benefits they get from cheap labour. Like, there's an obvious benefit in that they're not actually going to be paid more. But past that, there's a benefit in terms of the calculus they make on whether they want to hire more people or whether they want to make an investment. So the obvious example here is those self-checkout things, right? Because the self-checkout things costs a capital investment. Now, if you have under the status quo, it's obviously cheaper to take that self-checkout machine or to just let them pay at the pump for gas. When you decrease the wage costs, you change that calculus so that instead of it being a better investment for them to get the self-checkout machine, it's a better investment for them to hire someone to take that job. And this is where you're going to get the creation of new jobs, and you're going to get benefits for businesses and benefits for the people, because there's going to be new jobs and there's going to be a better, more relative or more realistic calculus. What happens when the minimum wage exists at this higher inflated level is that it favours infrastructure. So you artificially create a lot of infrastructure in these situations, and you artificially exclude people from the market when their skills would allow them into that, given how low they are when you're talking about people who are having their first jobs. We think that this artificial gap prices people out of jobs. We think that this could easily be solved by human capital. We think this is far better for businesses. Things like technology are a short-term solution when they're replaced by other technology, all these kind of things. We think that this added business cost is not something that businesses should have to be bearing. It's something that can be easily alleviated by them just hiring someone with less skills, like your checkout chicks. So the second point in this is once they've been incentivized to hire this person, they then have a margin where they can increase that person's wage if they want to. We're saying that the minimum is $10. We're not saying you can't price someone above that, you can't pay them more than that if their skills are worth that. And we believe that with these transitory workers, if their skills prove to be more beneficial to a business, they will be paid better. We're not saying that they can't be paid more. So we see that once you have trained your person at their checkout or their petrol pump, we see that these people will then get a pay increase to recognise their increase in skills, and they're actually going to be kept on. I actually like to think that these people, as soon as they turn 18, would be fired. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we have labour laws. Like, you can't just fire someone for no particular reason just because you have to pay them more. We see that you can incentivise these transitory workers then to stay within the company, and there's a financial benefit to them staying so they don't have to start somewhere else. So what we're talking about here is a fair start. We don't get it under the status quo, we do get it under our proposed model, and so we propose.
Equal pay for equal work. It's more than just a slogan. We think it actually represents a very fundamental value of our society. And that's that we shouldn't discriminate between individuals based on essentially a class that they belong to. Just because youth happen to be youth and youth as a whole might have high rates of unemployment isn't a reason why particular youth shouldn't be granted the protections that we think are necessary to protect vulnerable members of our society. And we think there are large classes of youth who are vulnerable, whose wages will be decreased and will suffer acute harm because of their policy. And we don't think they've been able to establish any point why those people owe a duty to those who are unemployed to sacrifice their own standard of living to help those people. So that's the problem we have with their case. I want to do a couple of things in this speech. The first thing is I want to articulate some key harms that Asher brought you that Janelle just refused to engage with that are important in this debate. Then I want to talk about discrimination and actually explain again why this matters, and they just can't brush it under the table by pointing to employment increases. Thirdly, I want to deal with employment increases, because they haven't been able to prove that youth employment rates will actually increase under their model, and we've given you good reasons why in the long term they'll actually decrease. And finally, I want to talk about the calculus of people choosing whether or not to enter the workforce. So let's start with harms. Asher clearly explained to you that youth are in a particularly bad bargaining position when it comes to negotiating for their wages. They're inexperienced, they often don't understand the employment process, they haven't done many interviews, they don't present themselves necessarily to their best. That means that in a system where they do not enjoy the cushion of a wage ceiling that is above the $10 allowed limit that they're giving, their wages will be systematically low. And this is one of the reasons we have a minimum wage, right? It's because we recognise that employees are sometimes bad at negotiating to get a recognition of the true value they contribute to the workforce. And we think youth are particularly vulnerable to that, and that's why we think a lot of youth will actually be paid less than the work that they're contributing to the business. That's important. Secondly, we see that businesses will engage in harmful practices that we don't think are actually very good. They're going to fire their older workers, who by their very analysis are some of the most vulnerable people in this debate. And then they're just going to cycle through youth workers, hiring them at 16, waiting till they're 18, and simply cycling through them. The only response there was that labour laws will magically prevent this, just like they prevented it back before when we had youth wages and supermarkets only hired 16-year-olds. I'm sorry, it's trivial to structure someone out of a job, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that's a response. So we think you will end up with systematically young and vulnerable workforces willing to be exploited. Those are harms they needed to engage with. It's unfortunate they did not. Discrimination. We have quite a clear case here. We think there are individuals who suffer acute and particular harm due to this policy. We're talking about youth who have families to support because unfortunately, outside of the middle class, sometimes people in fact get pregnant before 18. We talk about people who've been disowned by their families, so they can't rely on the support networks that they want to talk about. We're talking about people who lack the skills to enter tertiary training and so never qualify for a student allowance because they never got university entrance and they lack the ability to participate in career training. Those are people who live paycheck to paycheck and rely on the fact that they have a job. And what are you doing? You're slashing their wages by 25%. That is an acute harm suffered by those people and one that we think it is immoral to put upon them. What was their reason for doing this? Why were they happy to impinge upon those people? Well, they said, in general, youth love living together. That's not a response, though, to the particular individuals who suffer this harm. You can't just show in aggregate they'll be okay. You have to show why the particular individuals deserve to have their quality of life compromised to help the other rest of youth. And we gave you clear reasons why that duty does not exist. You don't owe a duty to others of your class. You should be treated as an individual. That's what a Western liberal democracy should do. You should be free from being discriminated against based on class. You should be treated as as an individual.
Richard.
Tom.
Can you point me to a whole lot of other people who on the minimum wage might also have trouble doing things like understanding their contractual rights with regards to like employment?
What? I'm afraid I don't understand what your point is there. Because yes, lots of people have trouble negotiating for their conditions. That's why we have a minimum wage, right, for everybody at $13, because we want to protect them. Like, that would be fun in your leader's reply. Anyway, employment. So this was essentially the heart of their case. They only win this debate if they can show a material increase in the amount of employment that exists. And we gave you a bucket load of reasons as to why this wouldn't work. Firstly, their main case, they didn't even get on in Tom's speech to why there'd be more jobs. They only talked for the first 5 minutes about substitution, or as they called it, fair competition. This isn't actually much of an improvement, right? Because youth can now compete as low-cost providers of labour with people who have families and are old and terrible at their jobs, right? Like, this is actually really bad for those older people who, in fact, still 20 years on, still earn the minimum wage, but have dependent families who rely on them. Employing youth at $9 an hour we think is a zero-sum game if you're kicking out someone who's older, and in fact, by their very own analysis, the youth are better able to weather it. So substitution, in fact, was a terrible point for them. But what about new jobs? Because they said that there'd be new jobs created because apparently labour is elastic, and so if the price of it goes down, people will hire more people. We said we don't actually believe that that's true, and we gave you a suite of reasons as to why that would be, that they never responded to. Firstly, we said that there's ruinous price competition in a lot of retail industries, so in fact they won't have extra money to spend, they'll have to spend it cutting costs to sell pizza for even cheaper than $5 on Super Cheap Tuesday, and so all of that will be consumed, we don't think they'll benefit. Secondly, they'll increase the hours of existing workers because they can, because those workers now need additional hours to make the money they were used to making, and that's a lot less risky than hiring new workers, no response. And finally, we said that they might invest the surplus their money they're making in investing in technology, which nicely deals with Janelle's split because it shows that actually, in fact, our side wins the point about technology. You hire essentially under status quo enough workers to make your store run, right? Then you can use your budgetary constraints to minimise the amount of stuff like technological investment. We think that people hire the same number of workers, but we have the freedom to invest more in technology, like labour-saving, self-checkout machines, and then in the long term you'll actually decrease the amount of labour that will be employed. And what was the only response? Youth will work night shifts that no one else will. Right, fine, that means they're actually in a position of bargaining strength. They'll earn a lot of value on the status quo because they can compete with those people on the willingness to earn night shifts. We don't see why minimum wage matters there. They should beat them under the status quo if that was true. So my split for the mighty time of 55 seconds. Changing the calculus of work. At the moment, you have to make a choice between working or going on the benefit. And the benefit only pays you about $5 an hour. But it does have one nice benefit. And the nice benefit of being on the dole is that you don't have to work. And so lots of people have to make an evaluation. Is it worth me getting a job for the additional money I get versus sitting at home earning $5 an hour playing Xbox? And what they do is they actually directly decrease the incentive to leave welfare dependency, for example, or the family home, and enter the workforce and become independent. Because now you're only earning $10 an hour versus sitting on a couch playing Xbox. And I'm not sure I'd give up playing Xbox for an extra $5 an hour, and we think a lot of people won't do that. So what's the problem with that? It means a lot of people never get into the workplace because they don't perceive it to be worth their time. But then what do they do to earn some extra money? Well, there are lots of supplemental ways you can earn your income in between massive Xbox sessions. You can work in the grey market where there's no tax and you have fewer protections, and they can work in the black market where there's illegality and socially destructive consequences. We don't think those are good outcomes for that side of the house, and that is one of many reasons why we're happy to oppose.
There's a couple of questions left at the end. The most important is, who's looking out for youth? The team which says that youth is not the defining characteristic of a human being, or the team that tells you that youth are worth less and we can pay them less? 4 questions after that. Firstly, let's talk about whether or not employment is going to increase, because they've never been able to substantiate that core practical benefit of their case from which all of their positive benefits then flowed. Then let's talk about discrimination, something which they never wanted to address because they couldn't address because the policy itself was discriminatory. And thirdly, I want to talk about harms by class and who's been hurt and why they don't want to talk about those people either. They never provide you with any substantive reason to believe that employment was actually going to increase. They told you about new jobs, and the core example of a new job was that people were going to employ more people to stand by petrol pumps. We didn't think that analysis was going to stack up at the end of the debate. Richard gave you a strong reason why that was. These bases are already well staffed. yourself to your choices to cut your employment costs and then either employ another person to stand by the petrol pump, not really increasing your efficiency, or to spend that money increasing the amount of technology you're using in your workplace and in the long term decreasing the amount of reliance you have on labour. When you provide businesses with this kind of surplus, we don't think they're going to invest in more labour, they're just going to use that surplus to exploit youth further. Next question. Are youth, by dint of simply being a couple of years younger than another person, worth less than that person? They gave you no good reason to believe that an individual young person is always going to be worse than an older person. And that's really important to this debate, because the principle we gave you at the beginning was that our community values the individual and the attributes of the individual, not the class to which they belong. It's dehumanizing to single out a certain group of people by a characteristic about themselves which they have no power over, which they did not choose themselves, and say that you are, to quote that side of the house, worth less and should be paid less, and somebody can spend less amount of money monopolizing your time. That has a whole number of harms. We told you that these individuals were going to suffer because their rates were going to fall. They're inexperienced at bargaining. That's the very reason we have a minimum wage in the first place, to protect people who aren't able to otherwise negotiate for their true value in the workforce. We said that the rate was going to drop as a result of that. We told you about cycles of hiring practices. Richard gave you the good example, which we know anecdotally to be relatively true, that supermarkets only hired young people for a whole number of years for the reason that you could pay them an absolute pittance and they could do the job just as well. The problem is those people were never on management track. Those people had an expiry date, and those people were fired when that characteristic about themselves, which they could not control, changed on their 18th birthday. And what about those people? Because on that side of the house, they wanted to characterise them as people who loved to flap, people who were able to stay up late and play video games. That was a description of students, because these two people sitting here are indeed students. The problem is, there's a lot of other young people in the community, and there's a lot of young people who have distinctly different needs to that, people who have dependents themselves, people who have to support families who are struggling to keep head above water right now. That's why we say a human being in New Zealand is worth at least a certain amount an hour, regardless of who they are. We think that remains true at the end of the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, Asher wanted to focus on individuals. What really upset him were the few who currently have a job at $13.75 and will retain that job at $10 an hour, but will get paid less. What we want to look at on our side of the house is the much larger, much more substantial group of people who are distinguished by their age, who currently don't have jobs, and who under our model will at least get an opportunity to participate in the job market, or at least not have an opportunity to feed their families, and that is what that side of the house has failed to deal with today. Two key questions to look at in this debate. Firstly, what impact are we going to see on unemployment, and particularly youth employment? And secondly, are there issues of class warfare and discrimination, which is really all that side of the house wanted to talk about today. Both sides have agreed, though, that jobs are really good and pretty important, so that's going to be the main focal point today. So, what have we heard from side E? Basically, we heard that there's not going to be more employment because firstly, young people will take adults' jobs, and secondly, when businesses save money, they just spend that money on other stuff because, you know, your pizza shop can't get any bigger, you've got enough workers, it's not like you might want to grab a bit more market share or anything like that. So, what did we bring? Well, what we told you is that under the status quo, the system that they're advocating, companies still face a trade-off between labour and labour-replacing technologies. Right? Companies still have to decide whether they want to hire another checkout worker or install a self-checkout machine. The only change under our model is that youth labour becomes more attractive because it's cheaper, ladies and gentlemen. We think that that alters, inevitably, the incentives placed upon companies, right? If you can hire more workers for the same price, that does put an incentive on you to expand your business. It makes it easier to do that. Less cost intensive, means there's less risk, it's easier to do things like drawing capital. That's never really analysed other than the fact that apparently businesses always stay the same size. We also talked about the fact that it creates new jobs for people who might be worth $10 an hour, but not $13.75, and whether that benefits. And finally, we talked about how if businesses do have money left over, they're unlikely to spend it on technology, because they're more likely to spend on things that maximise labour efficiency, which in the long run means that we actually get jobs enshrined in these businesses that aren't just going to disappear as technology comes. So on that grounds, we've shown you there will be more employment. and what's more, that employment is particularly valuable for youth who need to get this foot in the door, who don't have experience, who don't necessarily have other opportunities. And secondly, let's deal with class warfare and discrimination. We basically hear from this side, discrimination isn't okay, and we shouldn't discriminate based on class. We've had three responses. Firstly, we told you that if these youth are worth $13.75, we think that competition for their skills will make them be paid $13.75. There might be a lot of workers in the market, but the really enthused, the really active, and the really skilled people in that market are still sought after. Secondly, we talked about how the minimum wage is a security net, how it's not about a right to be paid $13.75, it's about the fact that we want to protect people at a standard of living that is reasonable to them. And we talked about how youth don't need $13.75, how $10 is plenty sufficient. And thirdly, and finally, we talked about how it's a lot better that these people actually have a job in the first place, that they're being employed on $10 an hour than sitting on the benefit on $5. If that side of the house thinks they can scrape by on $5 an hour, we don't see how $10 an hour is going to be an issue. What we've stood up for today is not the individual, it is the group. It is the group of people who have no jobs. And if we have to take the cost that a few people will lose out on $3.75 an hour, we're happy to do that. Because that, ladies and gentlemen, is a minority. They are not the most vulnerable. We are proud to propose.
Thank you very much to our teams from Canterbury and Victoria for a spirited debate. I think you've given us lots of things to talk about, and I'm particularly pleased to see that there are people in this room who are able to speak even faster than I usually do. So, we have to give our three judges about 3 to 4 minutes, hopefully, to come up with the result of tonight's debate, which will give you a chance to grab another beer, or maybe even a slice of cold pizza. Thank you.